Sometimes, the moment that changes your entire life comes when you least expect it. You're sitting in your favorite chair, staring out the window, lost in memories, and suddenly something inside you shifts. It doesn't always happen with a bang, it doesn't always feel dramatic, but quietly, without warning, you realize it's time to act. That's exactly how it happened for me. I'm Jonathan Morrison. At 72, I thought I had seen it all. But the moment I first realized that my own daughter and son-in-law had decided to betray me is something I'll never forget. It all started on an ordinary evening. I was sitting in the chair I've spent most of my evenings in since my wife, Laura, passed away. It was quiet, and I was enjoying the peace. Suddenly, I heard my daughter, Clara, come home and start a conversation with Pete, her husband. I had always known that my kids had become busier, especially Clara, but I didn't expect to overhear this conversation. I couldn't make out exactly what they were discussing, but by Clara's tone, I could tell something was off. She was talking about my condition. It wasn't the first time she'd mentioned that I needed more attention and care. But this time, it was different. I could feel the tension in her voice, her growing certainty that it was time to do something. She said something about how I needed to be in a facility where someone could take care of me. That's when a chill ran down my spine. I didn't understand exactly what they were planning, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't about care, this wasn't about my old age. It was about money, about the house I'd built, which had always been a part of me in my life. I sat there, in silence, my fists clenched, realizing that my own daughter and son-in-law were plotting to decide my fate. They were ready to get rid of me, to sell my house, a house I built with my own hands, simply because I was no longer useful. But I wasn't the man they thought I was. This wasn't just betrayal. It was the moment I realized that I could no longer sit by and wait, hoping for their kindness or help. I couldn't allow them to dictate my life as though I were just something to be discarded. I've always been someone who built my life with my own hands. I worked hard, made sure to have what I needed, and even when it was tough, I kept going. So why should I, now that I'm older, just give up everything I've worked for? I wasn't ready to surrender. I knew I had to act. I started thinking about how to take back control. How could I stop being a victim and take back my independence? I realized that I needed to sell the house. Not to please Clara and Pete, but to start a new life. That thought, which came to me in that moment, became the turning point. That was my first step towards change. I wouldn't let anyone decide for me anymore. I would determine my own fate. It was the moment I realized that my life would never be the same again. When I overheard Clara and Pete's conversation, I realized that my life would never be the same. They were discussing sending me to a nursing home so they could sell my house and use the money for their own needs. It was like a thunderclap out of nowhere. I sat in my chair, staring at an old photo of Laura, my late wife, and suddenly everything that had seemed stable and unchanging fell apart like a house of cards. They thought I couldn't hear them. Clara was speaking so easily, as though she had already made the decision for me. She claimed that it was time, that I had become a burden. Pete agreed that it was better to not drag it out. By selling the house, they could start a new life, get rid of me, and maybe buy a property in a better neighborhood. To them, I was nothing more than a source of money, and they had already planned what would happen when I was gone. It felt like a sentence. But I sat there, listening, and in that moment, something inside me broke. Yes, I knew I was getting older. I understood that I wasn't the man I used to be. But I had always been taught that you are the master of your own life, and no one has the right to decide for you. That thought wouldn't leave me. I couldn't just sit by and watch them take control of my life and possessions. I was still alive, and as long as I was, I had the right to decide what I would do. I remembered how Laura and I had built this house together. How we chose every detail, every brick, every piece of wood. We put our lives into this house, our effort. It wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of our hard work, our sacrifices, our hopes. And now they were planning to sell it just because I had become too much? No, this wasn't going to happen. I decided to sell the house. That was the only way to take back control. And even though I wasn't young and didn't know all the legal details, I knew I had to do it right. I couldn't let Clara and Pete handle it their way. I was ready to start a new life, but to do that, I needed to figure out how to handle everything correctly. I couldn't afford to make mistakes. I couldn't let anyone take advantage of my age and condition. I immediately realized that I couldn't do this alone. I wasn't a lawyer. I didn't know all the ins and outs of real estate law or protecting my rights. I needed professional advice to make sure everything was done correctly and legally. I needed to be sure that this process would go smoothly and without any surprises, and that no one could manipulate me, using my age and health against me. I needed to find a lawyer I could trust. I started calling attorneys, looking for someone who specialized in real estate and family law. After several consultations, I chose Todd Fisher, an experienced lawyer with good recommendations. He was a real estate specialist and had often helped elderly people deal with property issues and ownership rights. I knew I had made the right choice. Now, I needed to meet with him, to understand how things worked from the legal side, so I could sell the house quickly and safely. I knew it would be a difficult journey, but I also understood that this was the only path I could take to regain my freedom. No one, except me, would decide how I would live and what I would do with what I had built. I was ready. Now I just had to prepare for the meeting with Todd. I was confident that this would mark the beginning of a new chapter, and though the road would be tough, I was no longer going to back down. When I decided to sell the house, I knew I had to understand the legal nuances of the process. I could act on my own, but I knew it would be better to consult a professional. This wasn't just about selling property. It was about control, a matter that concerned not just me but also my family. Clara and Pete had already made decisions for me, and I was ready to fight for my rights. When I met Todd Fisher, I was already more calm, but still felt a sense of unease. I wasn't sure how the meeting would go, how the legal details would be explained, and what exactly I was supposed to do with this house. However, from the very start, Todd created an atmosphere in which I felt I could trust him. He was a professional in his field, and he immediately invited me to sit at the table where the documents and folders were already laid out. I told Todd everything that had happened, starting with Clara and Pete discussing how I should be sent to a nursing home, and they could dispose of the house. I explained how I had overheard their conversation by accident, how shocked I was that they had essentially started planning what would happen to my life and property without thinking about me at all. Todd listened attentively, without interrupting, and then he calmly but confidently began explaining that after Laura's death, the house officially belonged only to me. I was the sole owner, and my children had no right to dispose of the property without my consent. This was a relief to me, although I knew that there was always room for manipulation in life. However, the law was on my side. He said that, by law, even if I were to become incapable of managing my affairs, no one could take my house without my permission. He also explained that selling the house was my full right, and if I wanted to, I could do it at any time. All the legal aspects of the sale process should not become a problem for me. He also confirmed that Clara and Pete couldn't interfere in this process unless I gave them permission to do so. I felt a sense of relief, but also a new responsibility. Now I knew I could sell the house without worrying about someone intervening in my decisions. Todd explained how I could prepare all the documents to make the sale as safe as possible. He mentioned that I could hire a realtor to quickly find buyers, and the deal could be completed in no time. He reassured me that selling property would not be a complicated task for me if I followed all the advice and recommendations. When I asked whether Clara and Pete could do anything to stop me from selling the house, Todd assured me that they couldn't do anything without my consent. He also explained how important it was for me to make all the decisions myself and not give in to pressure. If they attempted to threaten or influence me, I could contact him, and he would help me resolve the situation. By the time the meeting ended, I felt much more confident. I was certain that now I could sell the house if I wanted to, and no one could stop me. I knew the next step would be mine to take, and I no longer feared what might happen. I thanked Todd for his help and left his office with a clear understanding that from now on, I would be the one making the decisions, and no one else would have a say. After my consultation with Todd, I felt much more confident. Now I knew I had every right to sell the house, and no one could stop me. But I understood that the longer I waited, the more likely it was that Clara and Pete would try to intervene. I couldn't afford to let them drag out the process, so I decided to act quickly. I realized that now that I had made the decision, I needed to move forward on my terms, without looking back at what others might think. The house, which I had built with my own hands, had become my fortress, but it was time to move on. I wasn't going to let anyone control my life, and especially not my decisions about selling this house. For that, I needed to hire a realtor. I didn't know all the details of the selling process, and the house needed some improvements to sell at a good price. My goal was simple: sell the house as quickly as possible, and I knew I needed a professional to help me do that. I called a few realtors, but the one that stood out to me was Mary Benson. She was an experienced agent with excellent recommendations and had helped elderly people sell their properties in the past. We set up a meeting, and she came over the same day to view the house. As soon as Mary walked in, I immediately felt that I could trust her. She carefully looked through every room, then suggested a few ideas on what could be done to improve the house's appearance. Mary was candid but respectful of the fact that this house had been a significant part of my life. She suggested a few minor repairs, refreshing the interior, and getting rid of some old items that cluttered the space. I understood that she was right. The house needed to look like a new place for someone to live, not like the remnants of the past. We also discussed the steps to take to attract more potential buyers. She recommended doing a photo shoot for the listing and posting it on popular real estate websites. Mary presented me with a few price options based on market trends and the condition of the house. She explained how she had determined the price, and it all made sense. We agreed on the value, and soon the house was ready for sale. I felt like with each step, I was getting further away from the attachment I had to this house, to these memories. I no longer feared their intervention. The house was on its way to being sold, and now I could move forward without looking back. I was no longer the person they could easily forget or use. I was the master of my own fate. Now I knew the process would be quick, and I could prepare for the next phase of my life. All that was left was to wait for the buyers. And this was my first step toward a new life. When Clara and Pete left for their business trip for a week, I felt like the moment had finally come. I was ready for a change, and this was my time. The house had long been a symbol of old grievances and manipulations, and I couldn't allow this heavy burden to stay with me any longer. I knew that if I didn't take action right now, their return would become another stage in something I no longer wanted to tolerate. All the paperwork was ready, the house was listed for sale, and the buyer who had shown interest was ready to finalize the deal. He was serious, willing to buy the house at the asking price, and move in immediately. He wasn't planning on waiting. I knew that if Clara and Pete came back, I wouldn't be able to make the deal as quickly, because they would certainly interfere. So this moment was perfect. I decided the sale had to happen while they were away, ensuring I could go through with it on my terms. When the buyer signed the papers and the realtor finalized everything, I felt a relief I hadn't expected. I hadn't just sold the house. I had closed one of the most painful chapters of my life. This was so much more than a real estate transaction. I had freed myself from what had been holding me back. I was no longer tied to this place, which had once been a symbol of life with Laura, but now had become something I didn't want to associate with my future. The new owner came the very next day, right after everything had been finalized. He was ready to move in immediately. That meant there was no time for Clara and Pete to come back and change anything. The house was already sold, and I knew that not only would I no longer be under their control, but they wouldn't be able to take it back for themselves. I was the master of my own life now, and no one, even those closest to me, could change my decision. As I left the house, I felt a heavy weight lift off my shoulders. This wasn't just about letting go of the property. It was about letting go of their manipulations, their attempts to control me and my decisions. I knew that Clara and Pete might be surprised or even upset when they returned, but I no longer cared. The house was sold, and that was my final step. The new residents had already started to settle in, and I no longer had to look at the walls that had once been filled with memories. Now I could start fresh. I was ready to move forward, leaving the past behind, without fear that someone would interfere with my decisions. This was my victory, and I had earned it. When I left the house, I felt not just relief, but pride. I was free. Now that it was all over, I could start a new chapter in my life, not answering to anyone but myself. I was no longer the person others wanted me to be. I was the master of my fate. When Clara and Pete returned home after their week away, I knew they would be shocked. While they were gone, I had done everything I needed to free myself from what had been holding me back. The house was sold, the new owner had already moved in, and I was no longer tied to this place. But for Clara and Pete, this was going to be a complete surprise. I knew they would come back expecting everything to be as they left it, thinking they could continue interfering with my decisions. When they pulled up to the house, the first thing that caught their eye were the unfamiliar cars parked on the driveway. Clara always noticed such things, and even in her tired state, she would have noticed that something wasn't right. They walked up to the door, and I knew they would realize immediately that they couldn't get in. I had changed the locks. I didn't want them to just walk in and begin trying to manipulate things again. When the lock didn't turn, I knew they would start panicking. Clara probably wouldn't understand what was happening at first, but Pete would likely have figured it out immediately. I'd made sure that they couldn't get in until everything was finished. It was my move toward independence. I didn't want to face them and explain my actions. I knew they'd be angry, but that wouldn't stop me. I could picture them standing in front of the door, trying to open the lock, trying to figure out what was going on. I could even feel their anxiety from a distance. Pete, probably, immediately started looking for the keys, thinking that maybe there was something wrong with them. But when they realized that the keys didn't fit, I knew their irritation would set in. I was ready for their call. Of course, Clara didn't hesitate and called me. I could easily imagine her voice, filled with confusion and anger, even without hearing it. She was probably asking about the locks, expecting me to explain this strange situation. But I wasn't going to explain. I wasn't going to justify myself. I was confident in my decision. When I hung up the phone, I knew they were left standing in front of the door, unsure of what to do. I didn't know how they would react, but I felt that it would be a shock for them. Now the house was no longer theirs, and I was the one deciding what to do with it. I knew they couldn't interfere anymore, and that thought brought me relief. They were stripped of control, and I could move forward. When it was all done, and I left the house, I felt not only relief but also pride. I was no longer the old man who could be forgotten, the one who would live by others' rules. I was a person who took control of his own fate. I was no longer dependent on their decisions, and now that house was part of the past. My life was in my hands, and this was the right step. When Clara and Pete returned home, their world instantly turned upside down. They didn't expect to encounter such a situation. With each step they took toward the house, their confidence began to wane. The familiar path they always took to enter the house was now blocked. The locks had been changed, and the keys they had always used didn't work. I can imagine them standing in front of the door, trying to open it over and over. At that moment, they must have felt like the ground beneath them was collapsing. The house, which they thought was theirs, was now shut to them. They couldn't enter, and there was nothing they could do about it. They probably didn't immediately understand what had happened, but when they couldn't open the door, it slowly dawned on them that their familiar world was falling apart. I could picture them exchanging confused looks. Pete, probably, tried to calm Clara down, but inside both of them, I'm sure, the growing sense of anxiety began to take hold. They stood at the door, unable to do anything. They were used to being in control, used to being able to return to their domain and continue with their plans as usual. But now that was impossible. They couldn't enter, they couldn't continue their plans, and there was no way back. I was certain that at that moment they realized they could no longer control me. They had been wrong to think they could, and now their world was utterly different. Instead of returning to the house and carrying on as they always had, they now had to figure out where to go. I knew this realization would be a hard blow to them, but in a way, it was necessary. After all, they had to understand that I would no longer allow them to dictate my life. For me, it was a moment of liberation. I wasn't glad that they were in this position, but I knew that it was time for me to move on. I had already made my decision, and now it had become a reality. I had sold the house, and that was my choice. Now, no matter how angry or confused they were, they couldn't change it. The house was no longer theirs, and I was the one calling the shots. I knew they would be upset, but I also knew it was the right thing to do. I was finally free from their manipulation. I can't say I was happy to see them in this situation, but I was glad I had broken free from their influence. They had tried to control me for so long, and I had let it happen because I had been weak. But now, I was no longer their puppet. I wasn't pleased with how they ended up, but I was pleased with the fact that I was moving forward. I had made the choice, and that choice belonged to me. When I made the final decision to sell the house, I felt like I was shedding old chains. I could feel the weight lifting with each passing day as I moved forward. I was ready to start a new life, unburdened by others' expectations or manipulations. Every step I took was a step toward freedom. And that was liberation, liberation from everything that had been holding me back. With each new day, I felt myself drifting further from the past. Now, I had the strength to begin something new. And this was my chance? My chance to move forward and never look back. I never thought I would feel such a sense of relief. Selling the house didn't just free me from the burden of property. It finally freed me from the feeling that I had always been someone else's burden. For years, after Laura passed, I had lived a life that felt borrowed. First it was Clara and Pete, and then my own indecision. All of it weighed me down, keeping me from moving forward. But now, looking back, I realize I made the right choice. Selling the house wasn't just a real estate transaction. It was a decision that opened the door to a new life. When everything connected to the house was settled, I felt a huge weight lift from my shoulders. All the fears and doubts that had haunted me were left behind, like a burden I no longer had to carry. The house, once full of memories, was no longer mine. More importantly, I was no longer tied to the life that had been forced upon me. I no longer lived for others, I no longer followed expectations that weren't my own, and I no longer gave into manipulation. I could feel myself being freed. Sometimes, reflecting on my past, I thought about how long I had lived in that shadow, the shadow cast by Clara and Pete. Even though they never fully overpowered me, I knew their attempts to control me had left their mark. I had been living in their world, under their rules, and I didn't know how to escape. But now, I was free. At that moment, I realized I had become the master of my own life. I could make decisions without fear that someone would challenge them. I could be confident that every new morning wasn't just another day to endure, but a day I chose for myself. I no longer felt the weight of someone else pulling me back, expecting something from me. I was no longer the old man who could be forgotten, the one upon whom responsibility could be dumped. Most importantly, I was no longer the person who let others decide for me. Every day, I feel myself growing more confident. My actions are no longer dictated by other people's interests. I live for myself, and this sense of fullness fills me completely. I am no longer afraid of the future, no longer afraid of growing old or being alone, because I control what happens around me. I do not wait for approval or guidance. I do not wait for anyone to tell me how to live or what to do. I make all my decisions on my own. I often think about how it used to be. How I lived under pressure, always trying to please, never daring to change. But now everything has changed. I choose what is important to me. And despite everything that happened, I am glad I did not remain in the past. Even if I had to go through it all again, I would not regret it. I have gained what I was seeking: freedom, confidence, and a sense of my own significance. Now, looking at new opportunities, I understand that nothing limits me. I have no desire to return to that world, where every step was controlled. I do not need someone to lead me by the hand. I can live by my own choices, and that gives me strength. The freedom I feel now is not just the absence of responsibility. It is freedom of choice, freedom from other people's expectations, freedom from manipulation, freedom from the fear of being unnecessary. I know I can do whatever I decide, and that is wonderful. I feel alive, and that matters more than anything else. Now I am ready for new opportunities. I have my own path, and I will follow it, no matter what. I can afford not to dwell on the past, not to look back at those who tried to control me. I am building my future, and that is what matters most. I have become the master of my life, and I know this is not just words. It is something I feel every day. It is my freedom, my strength, and my pride. And I will move forward, enjoying every moment of this new life.